What is going on, Hot Take Nation? David Ramsden-Wood here for another episode of the Hot Take of the Day podcast. And one of my personal favorite episodes that we recorded was with Bud Isaacs. And for those who saw it, I got to go to his home. His wife had COVID and he was in Vietnam, war vet, oil guy, and he shared stories for an hour, and I spent about 5 hours with him that day. He was one of my favorite interviews. And so I'm very, very pleased and blessed to be joined today by Q Spaulding. And Q has a very interesting background, including his involvement in starting Encore, the television network. So when you get to watch your favorite movie like Groundhog Day or other movies you love, Q is at least one of 4 people that made sure that that happened. So first, Q, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much, David.
For the listeners who don't know you, would you give a little background, a little narrative on your life to this point? And we're gonna cover all things history, but I wanna get the listeners to know who you are.
Well, where to begin? I'm 80 years old. I've lived in a lot of different places as varied as Manhattan, which I lived in for 25 years, and Fargo, North Dakota, where I lived for 10 years. And I attended Columbia University. I graduated from Columbia Business School, and pretty much had a traditional career in business. Ended up in the cable business, which at the time was really the place to be. It's not so much now, but in the early 80s, cable television was hot. And then I retired in 2003, and I'm living in Monterey, California.
So talk to me about the change in cable, and one of the things about being in the oil and gas industry that the listeners who are understand is when you're a growth industry, it's really great. You get all the money, you get to do all the things. I imagine media in the 80s as bandwidth was increasing and entertainment value was increasing and dollars spent on it it was just the place to be. How do you compare the media industry back then to what we see today, and what do you think has become of that industry, the cable industry in particular?
Well, let's talk about the media industry in general. I wouldn't just limit it to the cable industry. The media industry, well, you just look at consumer surveys. People do not trust the media. Unfortunately, it was Trump that coined the phrase. For a lot of people, it's unfortunate. Some people, it's fortunate, of fake news. And there is a ton of fake news, things they don't cover. The biases on both the left and the right. It doesn't matter. If you're watching Fox News, it's on the right. If you're watching MSNBC, it's on the left. If you read the New York Times, the New York Times is disintegrated into something I don't recognize. I used to read the New York Times almost cover to cover every single day. I read every story on the front page and all the editorials. And that was back in the 70s and 80s. The editor was a guy named Abe Rosenthal. Abe Rosenthal would never, ever, ever have tolerated the nonsense you see at the New York Times with really stupid things like this 1619 project that they put out that claims that the American Revolution primary purpose was to preserve slavery. I mean, it's just absolute I don't know how they get away with this nonsense. You've had prominent historians on the left, really progressive historians, saying this is just absolute nonsense. But the Times puts it out, but if he were alive today, Abe Rosenthal, these things would never get through the editorial process.
So why do you think it's changed so much? And I've talked to journalists in the past couple months, and they recall stories from when they were in journalism school, and the professor would say, you're putting way too much opinion in this piece. It really needs to be the facts, or kind of the way I envision Walter Cronkite used to do it. And now you just can't get away from, if you're the New York Times, every time you mention Trump, there's a comma, and then it said who fraudulently did this and horribly did that, comma, and then they carry on with the story. What's changed that has made us this? Is it social media? Is it just the business model? How do you foresee or see that?
Well, it's irresponsible journalism. I don't know. I was a journalist in high school. I was the sports editor of my paper. But I did learn basic journalistic principles. You know, there is news and there's opinion, and you have to keep them separate. But now you find opinions on the front page. And nobody reports the news just objectively. I don't see that anyplace. And that's not, you know, to knock the left or the right. That's just the way it is. Now, one of the things that's happened is competition in the media world has become so intense that they strive to be more outrageous than the other guy. So, you know, MSNBC with how horrible Trump is, and he did this, and Russia. And then on Fox News, it's Joe Biden's son is corrupt. And maybe all that's true. I don't know, but it's tough to discern facts when all they're doing is just ranting and raving about their point of view.
So I mentioned in the start Encore, and talk to me about the genesis of that idea and how you were involved in starting Encore, and what it's like to, you know, go to a TV and see in a way your legacy just continues to survive.
Well, here's how Encore got started. John Malone was the chairman of a big cable, the biggest cable company at the time, Telecommunications Inc. It's been sold off and it doesn't exist, but he was running the cable company. And what was happening in the cable business is what we call basic cable was getting bigger and bigger. They added ESPN, Discovery, CNN, and all those things cost money, and the cable operator would just add it to the bill. So if you wanted to buy HBO, when HBO first started, literally the basic cable plus HBO, maybe $15 a month, okay? But as you added more of these basic services, now basic cable became $70 a month. So to buy HBO on top of that, now it's $82. It used to be $12. Now it's $82 a month. And what Malone was finding is people were dropping off of HBO and Showtime because the bill was just too high. So Malone said, you know, just to his staff, he said, what we need is a very high quality, very low cost movie service. Now, it sounds like difficult to do, but it actually wasn't. And what we did, we wanted to have high quality, nothing but the best movies. So we looked at the landscape of what was being offered now. You had HBO and Showtime offering current movies. You had American Movie Classics and Turner Classic Movies offering the old black and white movies. But nobody was offering what we called the hit movies of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Now, HBO would play, say, Kramer versus Kramer, movies of the 70s. They would play it, but they played it at 2 a.m. So we came out and said, we play those movies for you in prime time. And it was a monster hit because you're really appealing to the people you're appealing to grew up with those movies. So they were very hungry for them. And we were able to get deals from the studios. We could actually sell the movie for $1 a month. And the cable operator would get 50 cents and we'd get 50 cents. And you could actually make a business of that. But then what happened is all hell broke loose in the cable television business when it went digital. So now you're going from 60 channels to 500 channels. And we said, oh my God, we're just stuck here with this little movie service at $1 a piece. We're going to get swallowed up. We're just going to get eaten alive. So we said we either have to get big or go home. So we decided, we went to Mr. Malone and we said, we either have to expand or we're just not going to make it. And we said, here's what we want to do. We want to introduce themed movie services, a Westerns channel, a mystery channel, a kids channel, an action channel, and a current movies channel called Stars. And we'll put those all together in a package, and we'll sell that package for, say, $10. So you get 8 movie services for $10 a month, and it's themed. So if you like Westerns, you can watch Western anytime. That concept took off like a rocket. And what happened with us is it was like every business, you kind of struggle at first trying to find your footing. But DirecTV launched in 1994. DirecTV couldn't get any programming because ESPN and Discovery and CNN, they were afraid of cable operators. Say, geez, if we go sell to DirecTV, the cable operators will punish us. But we didn't have any relationship with cable operators because we just started. So we embraced DirecTV and they embraced us, and they made us part of their core package. And our revenue just took off like a rocket, like an absolute rocket. And we became extremely profitable in a couple of years.
And so is that when you retired, did you retire from that organization in 2003?
Yeah, I did.
And so when Netflix came on the scene, and obviously at the time, you think about Blockbuster and you look back and you say, well, Blockbuster had this massive infrastructure. There's this up and coming startup guy that's using broadband, and Blockbuster really didn't respond the same way that hotels didn't really respond to Airbnb and taxi companies really didn't respond to Uber. When you saw Netflix and come on the scene, what was your response and reaction? And did you recognize it for the threat that it has become?
Absolutely not. In fact, I'm glad I'm not still there, because we missed this one completely in the 1990s when Netflix first started. This is embarrassing, but I'll tell you, we actually called it Flintstones technology because they were mailing. Remember, they were mailing.
I remember their original, and they had like red boxes. Maybe it was not even red boxes, but red box came up after. But yeah, they were mailing movies.
Later, the vending machine, but we laughed at Netflix. They said, what is this? But all of a sudden it started to catch hold. People started to like it. Once they started streaming, it was over. Now, cable companies are the ones in trouble now. Cable, kids don't subscribe to cable. Just start with that. 20, 30-year-olds, they don't subscribe. They get everything they want online. And that's really hurting the cable. Oh, it's killing the telephone companies too. Young kids don't have telephones, landline telephones.
Is that what's, in your opinion, is that part of what's led to this demise of journalism? Because I think about it from, with what we do with the Hot Take of the Day and put out content, and the barriers, distribution is obviously very challenging, but the barriers to create content are very low. And so for newspaper companies who sell, newspapers, but primarily ads, and for cable companies who sell their package like CNN, but then also sell ads, it seems like they've been forced, because of the business model and how much free content is available online for people to get. They've been forced into this role of just hyper opinion, echo chamber creation for retention. Is that too simplified for what's happened?
No, it's exactly what's happening. And in the process, they're going to destroy themselves. There are still rigorously honest publications. My favorite's the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal, it tends conservative, but it's not radical right. But they give a balance on everything. They were very balanced the way they treated Trump. They recognized his personal shortcomings, his temperament shortcomings, but they also recognized the things he did dealing with China, with the economy. They were very balanced, but you just don't find that many places. I mean, you will not find a New York Times, Washington Post article over the last 4 years that has said anything positive about Trump. Now, I always say this about people I don't like. Nobody does everything badly. Nobody makes every decision a bad one. Nobody does that. So, but that's the way they treated Trump. Everything he did was bad, no matter what it was. And people look at that and say, this isn't journalism. This is just propaganda. And that's where you see, fake news has become a real, it's a phrase that resonates with people because they know it's fake. Well, I'll give you an example. When they killed the Hunter Biden story, that was a big story.
That was a big story.
Here, the incoming president is on record on all kinds of email records, participating with his son in a partnership with a communist China company, and he was going to get 10% of the action. He's the sitting vice president setting all this up. This is insane, but nobody covers it. Nobody covers it. This is absolutely unbelievable.
So it's funny that you mentioned that. One of the journalists I follow, and I think again timing is so much. But Glenn Greenwald, who
I
he's
love
been
Glenn. By the way, I love Glenn Greenwald. And Glenn Greenwald is a lefty, but he's honest. He is very, very honest, and he's consistent. That's why I like him.
Yeah, he is. And for those who didn't follow, he was one of the journalists who in October was bringing forward the Hunter Biden. And I mean, we can talk about and we are going to talk about the state of the stock market as it compared to things, in the 60s and 70s when you were in arguably the prime of your career. But it's truly amazing how that story was taken, crushed, censored. The New York Post was censored on Twitter. Facebook censored it. Twitter censored it. Glenn Greenwald resigned and then published the story, but it really didn't get picked up. So it didn't sway the election. And I remember in 2016, the Stormy Daniels story was sure picked up by everywhere that was salacious. But it's crazy to think how the narrative that a media company selects is the correct one, whether it's climate change or whether it's Hunter Biden and Joe or racial injustice or whatever. That narrative is what everything is geared towards and written towards. I get the sense, like, I didn't grow up in the 60s, but I think that the racial strife and civil strife in the 60s, does it compare to what we have today, in your opinion, having been around for both of them?
Well, yeah, they're actually, in my opinion, there are two differences. The racial strife in the 60s, you got to understand the situation. Jim Crow was alive. Blacks were forced to use different restrooms. They couldn't eat at any restaurant, a good restaurant. They couldn't stay at a good hotel. They couldn't get a decent job. They couldn't even go to college in the South. Couldn't go to college. State schools that their taxes helped pay for couldn't go. So the oppression was so unbelievable. Tens of millions of whites were outraged. Everybody was, what is going on? So you had, and by the way, to his credit, Lyndon Johnson, we'll get back to Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson was a virulent racist when he was in the Senate, virulent racist in the early days with Richard Russell, Strom Thurmond, and Robert Byrd's father. They were the cabal that kept civil rights legislation from moving forward. But what Johnson realized, he had tremendous political instincts, and he realized that those explosions in the mid-60s in Watts, in Newark, in Detroit, he realized that this could bring the country down. He knew that. He knew this was big, and he knew that the Black community had tens of millions of supporters in other communities, in white community. So he moved fast. He just pushed the Southerners aside. This is it. We're going to have civil rights legislation, and he pushed it through because the oppression was so egregious that something had to be done. Okay, now here we are now. Now we see something. This is just my opinion, by the way. But you see something like the George Floyd horror show. That was
horrible. Most tragic thing you could imagine.
I can't imagine it. It was just horrible. But what I say, those incidents, those are the highlight reels, if you will. You use a sports analogy. Those are the most egregious. The young boy getting shot in the back in Georgia. I mean, these are horrendous. But the real issue is not the police shootings, because you can see statistics that police actually shoot blacks less than they do whites. And there's all kinds of statistics like that. But the real problem now, David, in my opinion, it's the tens of thousands of disrespectful interactions that blacks have with police every single day of the week. Every single day, they have difficult interactions with the police. And to me, it's just constant. It never goes away. You'll hear black mothers say that when their son becomes 12, 13, 14, they have that talk with them. They call it the talk. Be very careful of police. They're not always your friend. Now, in terms of the police, a good friend of mine was a police chief in the Phoenix area. His wife was a police chief up here at Seaside, right next to Monterey. And I was talking to him once we were talking about the George Floyd thing. And I said, you know, you have 800,000 policemen in the United States. I said, my guess is that 1% of them are both racists and sadistic. Combination. They're sadists and they're racist. He cut me off immediately. He said, no, it's 8%. 8%. So you have 800, that's 64,000 officers that are both racists and sadistic. And so they get you see it all the time in these black communities, and truly there's a lot of crime there. There's no question that in some of these, you know, housing projects, but they just club people around. They just indiscriminately club them around. And that's exactly what the problem is now, I think.
Well, it seems, and certainly, you know, there was an uprising to discuss this, and again, we talk about media narrative. You see a lot where they say, well, the overwhelming majority of the protests were peaceful, and so that's the way they frame it. And it's really interesting because there's a website that looks at protests, and they said that 93% of the roughly 9,000 protests that were held over 90 days were peaceful, but 7% weren't, which kind of ties to your point that 8% of officers are probably not good. There's probably 8% of doctors are probably not good. 8% of teachers aren't good. But it all kind of ties together that we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We got to address what the real issues are, which in the 60s was access to university that they were paying taxes for. And now it's, you know, risk from police officers, and that there isn't a very quick system if an officer abuses their power to like immediately bring them to justice. Would you agree with that?
Well, talk about the solutions people are offering. Defund the police? Are they kidding? See, they go to insane solutions, but really absolutely insane. Not even, you know, geez, you may want to adjust your thinking a little bit. Like you need to see a shrink quickly with the defund the police. In fact, there was one Democratic congresswoman on a conference call with all the new electees. She pleaded never, ever, 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 ever use that defund the police phrase again. It's killing us. Talking about Democrats. Yeah, so you get these radical, stupid things like defund the police. But if you want my opinion, why can't you get rid of these 8%? The unionists. Simple. You can't fire a cop. It's like firing a teacher. In fact, there was an article in the local paper here today. There are 30,000 school teachers in California. Every year, 2 get fired.
2 out of 30,000.
Or two. And that's because it takes a year to fire them. So it's the same thing with cops. Bad cops. Everybody knows who they are. Everybody knows who these people are. The cops that work with them know who they are. But you can't fire them because they're protected by the union.
So if you think about in the 60s versus today, so you talked about what the differences are. Do you feel like the civil strife and the angst between the sides and how does it compare historically to the 60s and like the I think it was the Black Panthers and race relations and everything? How do you think about that?
Well, I'll tell you how I think about it. See, you're thinking about it in terms of individual issues: climate change, race relations, GDP, the economy. I think about it in much broader terms. There are, to me, 2 absolutely overwhelming issues. One of them is substantive, and the other is kind of cosmetic, but it's still a big issue. The substantive issue is the massive, in fact, I'll use the number 27. That's the big issue. $27 trillion in federal debt. Trillions and trillions of dollars in debt in places like Illinois, Connecticut, California, Minnesota. Massive debts from cities. Chicago's broke. Absolutely. We never had that back in the 60s. Now, We did have, actually, in New York City, I was living in New York City. New York City was virtually bankrupt in the 1970s. And what happens then, a lot of people know it was a miserable place in the 70s. There was graffiti, they had baseball game, Bronx was burning. You remember that? That Yankee game, they showed the neighborhood was up on fire. So, you know, we had what happens when you go broke, when you, like New York City was, is they appoint a trustee to take over. It was Felix Roatan, who at the time was the head of Lazard Frere. What happens when he comes in is he takes over the city. The police union want to raise. He says no. He wants a pay cut. Pay cut goes in. They want this or that. No, 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 no. And we're going to cut spending here, and we're going to cut spending here. And the politicians have nothing at all to say about it because you're in bankruptcy. So the same thing happened in Detroit. The trustee comes in. Now, here's what happened. Look at Detroit. What do? The bondholders get stiffed, not completely, but they get stiffed. The pension people take a pounding. They take a pounding. Their pensions were cut in half. So if you had a $1,500 pension, and you were using it to live, pay your rent, and pay your bills, and now it's $750, you're in trouble. You're in trouble. So the debt overhang is staggering. Now, how do you go? There was a great line in the novel by Ernest Hemingway, The Sun Also Rises. There's a character named Mike. Mike is bankrupt. His friend asks him, how do you go bankrupt? And he said, 2 ways. First slowly, and then suddenly. And what makes that phrase so poignant, it's just so true. Bankruptcy, even a personal bankruptcy. Yeah, you pay one credit card with another credit card, you're behind on your mortgage, so you kind of juggle all your resources, and it takes years for them to catch up with you. But then if they foreclose on your house, it's over. And that's what's going to happen with these cities, with these states. It's going to be over. Look at Greece. The same thing in Greece. We're not different than Greece. They're bigger, but not different.
So it seems to me that that's one of the things that isn't being talked about, because you said we have 27 trillion of debt, which is true. The Federal Reserve has been putting in 250 billion of liquidity each and every month to make the markets function normally, because in March they weren't. But now normal functioning markets have short squeezes in GameStop, massive volatility. There's like no punishment for risk taking. And at the same time, you have the service industry has been decimated. You have 20 million jobs that are either underemployed or unemployed. And you have cities that are losing tax revenue. And you have Biden, who has taken actions through his executive executive orders rather, that seem to be sort of biasing more to the spend, and they're not addressing the tax. Does it concern you? And as someone who's 80 and looking back on their life, how concerned are you for the youth of today and the state of the finances of our country go forward?
It's absolutely horrible. Well, you said right at the beginning of your comments, you mentioned that nobody's paying attention to it. Notice it's under the radar. No national politician has brought up the issue in a serious way of the national debt since 2011, when Paul Ryan made a presentation to Obama and they just insulted him. He was talking about you have to cut back Medicare, Medicaid. So they showed commercials of Granny being pushed off the cliff. Nobody wants to talk about it.
Granny's always a risk. COVID Granny. Granny.
Granny gets in trouble all the time. But here, you got to ask yourself, if it's that much of a problem, why is no national politician even bringing it up? Very simple reason. Very simple. First, you start with the politician's greatest need. Every politician has one need that overrides everything else: getting reelected. Getting reelected is forget the American people, their constituents. Getting reelected is everything. Okay, now once you understand that, then you understand why they won't talk about the national debt. Here's why they won't. They need more money. You either have to bring in more revenue or cut expenses. Let's talk about the revenue side. Everybody talks about tax the rich. the billionaires. There aren't that many of them. If you took every nickel from every billionaire in the United States, you could run the government for 6 months. Take everything they have and you run the government for 6 months. And every politician knows the real money is in the middle class. The real money is in the middle class. And the middle class votes. That's the biggest voting constituency in the country is the middle class. They vote. So if you're going to get more revenue, you have to have massive tax increases. If you're going to solve it with revenue, massive. I mean, you're going to talk about a family of four making $100,000. Maybe they're paying $22,000 in taxes that have to pay $60,000 or $70,000 in taxes. That will never happen. Okay, let's talk about cutting spending. The only place to cut spending because or have an effect is in the entitlements. That's where all the spending is. And they're on automatic, robo control. Now, if you want to cut spending, you're going to hang on for this. Massive cuts to Medicaid, massive cuts to Medicare, and massive cuts to Social Security. That's the only way it can be done. Now, who does that impact? The middle class. And what do the middle class do? They vote. So this thing will never get solved until the Ernest Hemingway character says, suddenly, one day you're going to wake up. Now, the reason we're able to sell bonds now is the Fed's buying them. Right. I don't think we could sell these bonds in the open market. The Fed's buying them.
I totally agree. The risk people are taking.
So one day you wake up and somebody says, this happens with every company that's gone bankrupt, every city. Somebody wakes up and says, wait a minute, your bonds are too risky. I'm not buying them. Well, now if you want to pay me 8-10%, okay, now you go through that scenario with $27 trillion in debt. You talk about a 10% interest rates, you're broke. You're out of business. So that's where we are. But nobody's talking about it. So this is a monster problem.
So it's funny you say that. So there's two little stats that I've heard that I think are, I've researched them, so I'm going to say they're true. In the last 6 months of life is when 160 out of the $560 billion annual federal Medicare, Medicaid budget is spent. So in the last 6 months, people are consuming 25% of the total spend, which does kind of point to our healthcare system has come so far and life expectancy is so high that we expect to live forever and we spend a huge amount there. And then the other one was in 1935 is when Social Security was passed. The average life expectancy at the time was 61 and clearly impacted by World War I, but that's what it was. And you didn't get Social Security until 65. You still get Social Security at 65, but our life expectancy is now 80. So we've gone from something like 3 workers for every retired person, or 13 workers for every retired person, to 3 for every retired person, which to your point, those are the two issues. And to even raise those, it's end of career for people.
Yeah, if a politician raises, but that's why you need a leader. And it's, what a leader is very amorphous. You can't defining it, but you need somebody just with the balls to step up and say, we got a problem, we got to deal with it, and convince the American people. It's going to be painful. Believe me, it's going to be painful.
So speaking of bankrupt companies, am I correct? You were at Hertz at some time before you went into the cable. Is that right?
The former chairman of Hertz lives not far from me. He was my boss. And I haven't seen him since they filed bankruptcy because of the shut-ins. We don't go anyplace here in California. But I woke up one morning, I said, we were the most successful car rental company by far. We made more money than anybody. We had the highest market share, and we had the best service. And I say, what the hell happened to our company? Well, what happened is the venture capital guys came in. They loaded it up with too much debt. They did something stupid and bought budget rent-a-car, thrifty and dollar rent-a-car, and they just piled on debt, and then the business slows down, they can't pay it, and now they're bankrupt. That's an unbelievable tale of mismanagement.
How has the car rental business changed from when you were running Hertz to to now. And again, you have capital structures versus business and M&A, and it slowly fails until it suddenly fails. What would you do if you were running a rental car company today coming out of the COVID crisis?
Well, first of all, a lot of people don't know this, but the rental car companies are not really in the rental car business. They're really in the used car business. And that's a big, big part of the profits. So it hurts. And my gosh, it's been 40 years since I've been there, but we used to be able to purchase cars, keep them in the fleet for 6 months, and sell them for more than we paid for them because we could buy them so cheaply. And then after 6 months, fix them up, clean them up, and sell them. And we actually made money, but a lot of money on used cars. The rental business is a fiercely competitive business because it's a commodity. You're selling a commodity, and you really can't distinguish, between Avis and Budget and National. They all sell current model cars. They all have low mileage. So then it becomes marketing. It becomes a real marketing game. And Hertz used to, well, I hate to bring it up, but back one of the best marketing campaigns ever in that business with the O.J. Simpson Superstar and Rent-A-Car. You remember that?
I do.
Now, here's what's interesting about that. At the time, we had the biggest market share. And everybody was limited to counter space. I had so much counter space in the terminal. So we had the longest lines. We had the slowest service because we had the longest lines. But after the O.J. Simpson commercials ran, the Superstar and Rent-A-Car, and he'd be running through airports, Hertz gets you in and out faster. No, we got you in and out slower. But when they asked people their opinions, they'd say, oh, Hertz is the fastest. They get you out of the airport fastest because that's what we told them. But exactly the opposite was true. So
isn't that a great, that's a great story.
Somebody from the Securities and Exchange Commission's not listening to this.
Well, I hope not too. That hopefully they're working on what's going on Wall Street right now with the short squeeze and some of the things. Have you been following this story with GameStop?
Well, yeah, I have been. And it's very interesting. I saw several conservatives on television today. Mike Huckabee was one of them, absolutely siding with the gamers, with the kids that they're driving up the price. And his position was, in a free marketplace, you're free to do anything stupid if you want. And if you want to buy a stock that's worthless and then lose all your money, go ahead. And if you think you can make some money, but that's the way it works. People assess the risk and then they plunge in. It's like with this Bitcoin. I don't understand this thing at all. It goes from $1,000 to $40,000, and there's nothing behind it. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, it's belief. The GameStop thing is interesting because I've been doing a lot. I'm going to write an article on it this weekend. The fact that a hedge fund went as short as they did, they weren't just short 100%, but ultimately the short interest in the stock was about 150%, which then, similar to when oil went negative in April, it creates crazy things when you have to take physical delivery and you have options and calls and margin and everything. But effectively, there's more shares sold short than there are shares in the entire company. And when people realized this and started using social media to share the story, there's basically no way the hedge funds can get out without owning 100% of the stock and the calls, which is like limitless losses. So to me, the big story was when we realized that the financial players yesterday shut down the ability to buy these stocks because they didn't have the physical stock to be able to cover, and the losses were so extreme. And to your point on the SEC, like, the system has loopholes that very smart, very sophisticated people are able to exploit and wipe out billions upon billions of dollars in days, which was truly shocking when you think about the cataclysmic effect that could have on the stock market go forward.
Yeah.
Talk to me about 1987. Do you remember that? So you would have been, so I'm just trying to place 20, so you would have been like late 50s.
Yeah.
Mid-career, late side of your career, and the market has a correction like that. the interest rates high, everything. How do you compare what you saw then, what you saw with the 2000 bubble, what you see with 2008, and what you see with today with the liquidity of the Fed and the COVID lockdowns, et cetera? How do you compare each of those?
Well, let's go back to 1987. I actually think 1987 is a little bit like today. Things just got overvalued. And yeah, there was a massive, I think it was 25% in one day, wasn't it? Something like that.
Yeah, Black Monday, October.
But you notice that stopped. And then it went back up gradually, but the plunge stopped because the correction had been made. Today is altogether different, in my opinion. Traditionally, stocks have sold for about 14 times earnings, going back 200 years. But in the last 15 or 20 years, it's been about 19 times earnings, maybe because of efficiencies, globalization, all that. Profit margins are high. So it's 19 times earnings. That's been for the last, say, 15 years. Right now, 35 times earnings. That has to be corrected. If you got a portfolio, assume it's only 80% as valuable as it is, because that's actually what it is. This thing has got to get corrected. And everybody, there's two ways to look at it. Either the PE comes down, which means that the stock value comes down, but most people root for the earnings to go up. So the price earnings ratio comes closer to reality. But I think there's going to be a big correction.
Which is for sure a challenge, because you're living in California, one of the states that has the most extreme lockdown measures. Although recently with Canada, not that it's a state, but Canada's gone pretty draconian. They're now having people who come back to the country, if they've been out of the country, are forced to quarantine in a hotel approved by the Canadian government for $2,000 for 3 nights. In spite of the fact that no hotels are open because everything's on lockdown. So it's like a 100% money transfer to the hotel industry. But you're in California. Governor Newsom, got in some trouble with his dirty laundry, do as I say, not as I do. There's been recall, there's huge taxes, there's financial issues, there's regulatory issues, there's energy issues. What's going on in California, and what's your take on the future of the state and COVID and the economy there?
Well, California, in my opinion, I've never lived any place that is mismanaged as California. It's a horror show. One of the reasons is that it's a one-party state. There's no competition, and the way they choose senators, House of Rep, they bless them. The Newsoms of the world. They blessed Kamala Harris to be the senator, and they to be vice president. But it's a one-party state. But let me just give you a couple examples. We have massive droughts here, massive droughts. The droughts tend to fuel fires. Okay, but let's just start with the drought. We get tons of rain out here. We get tons of it, especially December, January, February. It gushes with rain. But there's no place to store it because the environmentalists won't let you build dams and places to hold it. Okay. By the way, California is controlled by two groups: the environmental activists and the unions. They make every single decision in California. Okay, but if they build more dams, you wouldn't have a water supply problem. Okay, our water bills are staggering out here. Fire is another one. Now, a lot of the fires are caused by electrical problems with PG&E and we have all overhead wires. So a spark comes off the grid, it lands in dry brush, and boom, now you got a wild raging forest fire. And that's a lot of the fires are started by the electric company. Now you say, well, gee, why don't they upgrade their plant? Well, good question. The reason they don't upgrade their plant is for the last 20 years, all of their profits have been mandated by the state to be used for wind and solar, to buy all the equipment necessary. It's very expensive to adapt all of your equipment to handle wind and solar. So they've been spending all their money on that instead of doing the nuts and bolts of upgrading their system. Incompetent management, again, just utterly incompetent. We have Homeowners insurance is another one. This one's a real beauty. We have people out here who cannot get home. I am on the verge of losing my homeowners insurance, and I couldn't buy it at any cost, at any price. It's not available. Now, why is that? Because the homeowners insurance companies have just taken a pounding with these fires. The Paradise Fire, which wiped out a whole town, Allstate had all the insurance in that town. They just got wiped out. The insurance industry has come to the governor and to the state with a solution, a simple solution. They said, guys, here's the way we solve this problem. We can insure everybody in the state. Every homeowner, I'm just going to make up numbers, but this is the principle. Every homeowner every year contributes $100 to a fund. Okay, and that the state keeps that fund. And the first $150,000 of damage to any home will come from that fund, but only up to $150,000. Then from $150,000 to $4 million, we will insure it. The insurance company, we'll take the hit. You know, loss, we'll pay loss. Now over $4 million, we will pool. We have $60 million homes down in Pebble Beach.
Right.
How do you? For them, say we will pool the $60 million home. So if we have 15 insurance companies, we will all share it. We will share the premium and we'll share the loss. Seems simple, that they just can't get it done. I mean, there's arguments about this, and you have insurance regulators. It's incompetence at its worst. And we're the most overtaxed state in the country. I mean, they want to tax. Well, Biden wants to now tax capital gains at the personal income rate. Now,
and potentially non-realized capital gains as well, if you believe that.
Well, that's another thing. And they're talking about wealth taxes. That was tried in France. They spend more money collecting the tax than they got because you can't appraise artwork and you can't. You know, it's too silly. But anyway, that's where we are.
What do you think? Do you think that there is going to be a flight from states like California, Illinois?
There is. Not going to be. There is. Look, we've had Elon Musk is pulling out of California, moving to Texas. Larry Ellison is moving Oracle out of here. Oracle's in Hewlett Packard of all pieces. I mean, Hewlett Packard is the first company in Silicon Valley. They're getting out of here. I mean, the regulations are just staggering.
So last question for you. If you could go back early in your life and meet Q at 30 years old, what advice would you give yourself that would have made things different? You know, obviously you don't want to change the path of your career, but what do you wish you knew when you were 30 that you know now that you could share with our listeners to help them on their own personal journey?
Boy, when I was young, I was a wise ass. I don't know how to say it any other way. I just couldn't resist the sarcastic remark. I could not resist it. And that actually hurt me coming up through the ranks, is I just couldn't resist saying the obvious when everybody knew the obvious, but nobody wanted to say it. I'd be the one that'd say it. If I had it to do over, I'd probably refrain from that kind of aggressiveness.
Interesting.
Sometimes it's best to keep your mouth shut.
I love it. I'm going to have to learn that myself, as listeners will attest.
Well, we all jump out, you know, with them. I can't, as soon as I hear somebody's opinion I don't agree with, I got to jump in. I mean, that's just the way I operate. But sometimes it's best just to hold your tongue.
I love it. Well, Q, I really appreciate the historical retrospective, I think, on where we are and where we're going and some of the concerns. And you know, if we spent more time listening to lessons of the past, I'm sure that we would be doing better as a country. And maybe some of these issues, that these hot buttons wouldn't be what they are.
Well, who is the philosopher? Santayana said, "Those who forget the lessons of history are doomed to repeat them."
I agree. Well, Q, thank you so much for joining us. And for listeners, until next time, be safe. Oh, go ahead, sir.
What?
Oh, I thought you were going to say something. I didn't want to
No.
cut you off.
I was just getting ready to figure out how to turn off my Zoom.
Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day, and bye for now.
Take care, David. Thanks.